Welcome to this evening's meeting, everybody. Thank you very much for your patience at the beginning there. And I always get hot and bothered when we have technical issues. But anyway, thankfully, they are few and far between. And I really appreciate you being here tonight with us. We're going to talk about promoting biodiversity and alternative food products tonight. And just to introduce myself, I'm Kerry Ritchie. I'm Head of Food and Enterprise at SAC Consulting. My colleague, Paul Mayfield, who's actually organised the event tonight, so thank you to Paul, is heading up the project that we're working on, and it's a Farm Advisory Service project, a Farm Advisory Service project, and it is all about that biodiversity piece and how we can innovate and develop enterprises on farm and in rural areas that can help improve and promote biodiversity and develop alternative food products. We will be recording tonight's meeting. In fact, that came on automatically. I didn't press any buttons. So that is being recorded, just so you're aware of that. And so let's explore and demonstrate some of the innovations that have been happening throughout our Scottish food and drink sector. So the aim of tonight is to stimulate ideas. We're going to hear from some really innovative businesses that have taken an idea, they've been brave and they've had the guts to take an idea, develop it, pull together a product offering, the result of which is a successful product range, but also they've increased biodiversity and natural capital of the land they manage. We have a short video to start, which I'm just going to do before we introduce the panel. So the running order, we'll have a short video. I'll introduce the panel. We're then going to have a chat with the panel. We're going to, if you can think of any questions along the way, do post them in the chat, or we'll be ready to ask them later on, because when we've heard from the panel and we've gone through some discussion, we're going to open the evening up for Q&A. So please do think as you watch the video about what questions you might want to ask. Thanks, Paul.
Can you see that?
Yes.
Good.
Can't hear it, Paul.
Can't hear it.
No. Whilst Paul's sorting out the video, I will just introduce the panel. So we have Marian and Simon, Marian Bruce and Simon Montador from Highland Boundary, near Ayleth in Perthshire. Marian and Simon have built a fantastic business called Highland Boundary Wild Scottish Spirits. If you haven't tried these, you must. They're fantastic. And they've built their business around improving biodiversity, creating a new generation of Scottish spirits that have captured the flavours of the wilderness around them, both on and close to their farm, and the collection and reflection of botanicals and wild picked foraged products. And Marian will tell us a bit about it if we get to watch the video, but will certainly tell us a little bit about that in a second. Our second panel member is Sascha Grierson, a colleague of mine, but tonight representing her business, Hugh Gardner Organic. So Sascha and her husband Hugh run this business. It's a traditional family farm in Perthshire, and it provides a full range of organic meats. And they're farming in a way that embraces and improves biodiversity. And last but not least, not only is Davy McCracken explaining how to run Zoom, which is fantastic, but Davy is a colleague from SRUC who spent over 30 years studying farming and biodiversity interactions and advising on agriculture and agro-environment policies. Davy, since 2013, Davy has been able to, in his own words, put what he preaches into practice. And his role is, and he's been doing that through his role as head of our Hill and Mountain Research Centre, which is based at our Kirkton and Auchentyre farms near Crianlarich. So that's the panel who you'll be hearing from later. What we'll do now is we'll just watch a very, very short video to introduce these guys. Thank you, Paul.
We bought the farm in 2008, and really right from the beginning we started to introduce more wild species, diversify the plant life that was here, really because we wanted to, but we understood the value of that. We're both biologists by training, so it seemed natural to really increase the number of habitats and the amount of wildlife that we had on the farm, both because really we understand the the resilience that biodiversity brings to our ecosystems, but also as part of our tourism offer. We really wanted to encourage as much wildlife so that people who were visiting had that chance to interact with the wildlife. So we knew about the spirits that they produced in Scandinavia and also in the Alps using wild plants. And in Scotland, we've really not had that. Well, not in recent history, we haven't had the use of our native flora in spirits, but over the rest of Europe, that was absolutely prevalent all over. And so in different places, you get different types of spirits made with different plants. And we really wanted to bring that to Scotland to diversify the spirits that we have within Scotland. But also it was really important, and what's become increasingly obvious is that by introducing people to our native flora through a drink that they're holding in their hand or a cocktail, it's actually a really powerful way of connecting them with the environment, but also with the culture around our plants that we've lost over hundreds of years. I think what we've learned over the past, well, more than 10 years we've been here, is that actually you have to go with what you really believe in. So I think a lot of people, when we first started the distillery, thought it was a bit odd that actually that we weren't making gin. Why are you not making? And people assume that we make gin. Well, we don't make gin because we don't have any juniper on our land. We don't want to buy juniper. It's about creating products that are authentic to where we are, and that sense of place really resonates with our customers, and that's why they buy our products. And you can't invent that. You have to work with what you have and work with what your land can support.
Hello, my name's Hugh Grierson. We farm in Perthshire here. Our farm is about 800 acres and it's a mixed organic farm with a mixture of crops, wheat and oats and peas with animals, livestock. We have cattle, sheep, pigs and chickens. And then we have a butchery, so we actually sell the meat from the cattle, sheep, pigs, chickens ourselves. Flavour of our meat is very important to us, having a butchery on the farm. And there's no doubt the feed we feed the animals has a huge influence on the quality of the meat we give out. This crop is an intercrop of wheat and peas. We plant the two together at the same time, and it grows a mixed crop for feeding to our livestock, to the chickens and the pigs. One of the problems, particularly with the chicken diets, the laying hen diets, is there isn't enough protein from the wheat that we can grow in this area. It tends to come out about 9–10% protein, but we want feed that's probably at least 16% protein to feed to our animals. By growing peas in the wheat, the peas feed the wheat crop, we get higher yields, but also the wheat pea mixture that we get has higher protein, and it means we don't have to buy in soya to feed our animals to get the necessary protein levels. We also use the herbal leys, which is a mixture of at least 10 different species to feed our cattle and sheep. Our cattle and sheep are pasture fed, that is they're not fed any grains. In the summer it's grazing, in the winter it's silage with maybe a bit of minerals supplement, but that's it. And the herbal leys are perfect for that. Since we've gone organic and then increased the diversity of our cropping, we've seen a build-up of diversity, biodiversity on the farm. An increase of the small animals, the slugs and the snails, the butterflies and insects. And that, of course, leads to an increase in the larger species as well.
Thank you very much. So listen, guys, that was very much a compiled version of 2 videos that we've made. We've also made a 3rd video on the flower field, and they are all available on our FAS website. So the links to that will be available at the end. And thank you, Marion and Sascha, on behalf of Hugh, for your time in producing those videos. It's always horrible watching yourself back on videos, so I know what that must have been like. I'd like to just ask Marion and then Sascha and then Davy to say just a couple of minutes each, introducing themselves and doing probably a little bit better job than I did in the interim. Over to you, Marion.
Hi, I'm Marian Bruce. We have a small farm just outside Aylwith. We're quite high up overlooking Strathmore, so we have relatively poor soil, but we also have lots of a little bit of woodland behind us, and we've planted lots of hedgerows, so we've improved the biodiversity here enormously since we bought the farm. And yeah, we have livestock as well. We have Hebridean sheep, and everything that we do on the farm is really driven by two things: by promoting biodiversity, but also by flavour. You know, what we produce here and the flavours that we have in both our meat and in our spirits is absolutely at the top of our agenda. So this is not in any way a compromise by improving biodiversity. It's not any way compromising the products that we have. In fact, quite the opposite. The biodiversity is at the root of what we do. And yeah, as a result of that, we sell our products at a premium. So our Hebridean sheep they are small carcasses. They take a long time to grow. They're slaughtered as hogget rather than as lamb. But actually they go into fine dining restaurants across Scotland, and we have, you know, local customers as well. So people who try the meat stick with it because it is just so amazing.
Thank you. Thanks, Marion. Sascha, would you like to say a little bit about your enterprise, please?
Good evening, everyone. I think the best way to kind of follow on from the video where Hugh did a fantastic job of introducing our business, and I think I'll talk about the business, is to say that really for us, going organic was the thing that provides us with the market-driven framework to be able to pursue our twin ambitions. For Hugh, it was very much, he grew up on the farm during what I call, I don't think he'd call it, what I call the chemical decade, and his father embraced all the improvements in technology that brought and the productivity, and that was the driver. And I think we must remember that farming moves in cycles, and you know, at that time when my father-in-law was farming here in the late 60s and early 70s, you know, there was still the prediction of, there was a concern for famine in Europe, and it was in everybody's consciousness that you know, food had been rationed, and so that drove the culture and ethos. So for us, so Hugh had watched the wildlife disappear, and he wanted to farm in a way that gave him a commercial enterprise, but that also allowed room for the wildlife to thrive. And how do you allow room for wildlife to thrive? You have to create the habitat for them to live in, and you have to create the habitat for the food, for the higher up species to be able to live it, that will thrive there. So I think that's very much driven, you know, his ethos, going organic, and then the various different things that he put back on the farm. You know, he put back hedges and planted trees, and also became very interested in how he could improve productivity as well. So the concept of intercropping, herbal lays, that's not just about providing habitat, it's actually about improving productivity and improving resource management. So I think what I love about the whole thing is that the thinking is very joined up. So the creation of habitat is joined up with the improvement in the optimization of our productivity. And there's no denying that it is reflected in the flavors of the meat. The breeds of animal that we use thrive in a fairly extensive environment. So we use native breeds of cattle. We use what's called an easy care breed of sheep, which is very much a functional breed. And that gives us a good commercial meaty carcass using animals that can thrive outdoors. They don't need to be clipped. Their wool goes back into the ground. you know, there's a lot of wins in the thinking. Anyway, I could talk and talk and talk, and I won't, so I'll stop
not
there.
At all. It's fascinating. Thank you very much for that, Sascha. Please appreciate that. Davy, oh, I almost called you Paul there because I'm seeing Paul on the screen. Davy, would you tell us a little? I mean, kind of following on from there, what Sascha was saying about how agriculture's changed. Do you want to give us a little bit of an update on what you've done at the 2 SRUC farms up near Cray and Lara?
Yep. So, and similar to Sascha, I can talk for Scotland about what we're doing and why. So please just stop me if time is pressing. So for those that don't know, Kirkton-Knockturtyre, we're 2,200 hectares. We go from 170 metres to over 1,000 metres, primarily sort of moorland grazing resource for primarily sheep, but we also have cattle on the farm. We rent the land from Scottish Government. We've rented it from Scottish Government for over 50 years. And it was rented by West Scotland Agricultural College originally, then SAC, and then now SRUC, primarily to look at upland research and demonstration, to actually test things out, innovate, see what works, see what doesn't work, and let farmers and land managers know the results of that. When we were formed over 50 years ago, it was primarily to look at the challenges, the agricultural challenges, of trying to actually raise livestock in this particular environment. High rainfall, we get 2.5 to 3.5 metres of rain a year at the lower levels, over 4 metres of rain a year at the higher levels. So it's a very challenging environment, and the grazing resource, while interesting from a wildlife and a biodiversity perspective on the hill, is very poor nutritionally from a livestock perspective. So that was the reason d'etre that we were formed. How can we actually improve livestock management in the uplands of Scotland, for all the reasons that both Sascha and Marion have highlighted in terms of a food production perspective. But 25 years ago-ish, it became clearer that the environment was becoming much more important. Environmental management was becoming much more important. And certainly I would argue very strongly that for all types of farming, but particularly for farming and land management in the uplands, you cannot separate out the production process from the impact, both positive or negative, on the environment. So 25 years ago, we started to put more of a focus on understanding the interactions between livestock and environment on the farm, but also what we actually had on the farm, what was important, and how to potentially manage it. Basically, because we were sort of duty bound to do that. And I'm presuming as we go through the evening, I can tell you more about exactly what we've done and why we've done it and how we did it. But I think the final thing to say for this particular piece is, which I didn't ask you to say in the introduction, is 3 years ago, as part of restructuring within SRUC, I also took the opportunity and was successful to create a wider integrated land management department. So the centre, I still head up the centre, but I'm also the head of this wider integrated land management department, which also has an education and training focus. And so within that, I've got staff dealing with wildlife and conservation management programs, and with forestry programs, with land-based engineering programs, with agricultural technology programs, and with what we're calling sustainable food production and land use programs. Because I believe strongly that we've got a lot of ask on Scotland's land. Scotland seems huge, but it's got a finite land area. And actually there's a close relationship between many of the sort of the land management practices and the multiple outputs we want out of it. So integrated management for me is going to be necessary going forward. We cannot continue to have silos where one part of our land use is purely production focused, others purely conservation focused, others game management focused, etc., others forestry focused. We need to integrate things a lot more, and that, for me, both before and now, I created that department, and certainly when I took over the Highland Mountain Research Centre, it's showing how you can integrate different outcomes, particularly environment and biodiversity, into such an upland farming system without replacing the farming system, without completely obliterating the farming system. It's integration is the key word. So I'll stop there, but you can pull more out of me later on, Kenny.
Thank you, David. And actually, it's fascinating. And I was sitting there thinking about you guys and what you've all done, and thinking actually now, when you think about some of the key trends that the consumer is looking for in the food and drink they purchase, this sustainability piece, is that this piece related to our planet, is hugely important now. And really, with that in mind, and I kind of like to just explore initially why. What was the reason why you went down this route with your business, and why was the biodiversity piece so important? And Marion, I'd kind of like to start with you, if I may, and then move on to yourself, Sascha, that really exploring that why. What was that catalyst?
I think for us, there probably wasn't just one thing. In terms of promoting the biodiversity on the farm, that was something that was absolutely the first thing that we did when we bought the farm. Because we're both biologists, because we're heavily into conservation, it was really important to literally do what we could to actually support species that were not present where they should be, and actually, you know, bring more biodiversity to quite a grass, really. So I think that was kind of at the root of it, but actually there were lots of different bits of information in terms of the way the business developed into the distillery. There was lots of bits of information that that came into that. It wasn't just one thing. Part of that was our connection with Scandinavia and an understanding of their food system and the way that they had changed their whole food culture. Part of it was information about the changes in HMRC regulation around still sizes and distillery sizes, and that's at the root of the huge small distillery boom that we have across the UK. So there was that piece of information. There was the fact that we had buildings that we'd renovated, we had availability of buildings, we had plants that we had brought in, but actually it was the flavour. It was actually understanding the history of the use of our own native plants, which was also part of that information that was all put together. And a lot of what we do is based on historical research from old documents, old recipes, and it's really interesting. The research that I've done, you know, suggests that these plants were used hundreds of years ago, and we've lost that connection to the way that we actually use our own native species, whereas across the rest of Europe that connection has been maintained over generations. But in Scotland, and I'm not going to go into the reasons now, but there have been a number of historical reasons as to why we've been disconnected from our own plants. So yeah, there was lots of different things. It all kind of came together, and we just kind of decided that we would go for it.
No, it's fascinating, the link there between the sort of heritage from the land and the flavour from the land. And Sascha, what were the sort of catalysts for you and Hugh going on the journey that you've been on?
Well, I think for Hugh, it was land management. For me, it's all about food. I grew up in a huge Irish family, and we're just obsessed with food. And in that very kind of, where does this come from? How do we grow it? Where has it been grown? Why can't we grow it ourselves? I grew up on a small farm. And in many ways, I think, you know, as people who grew up in a rural way, you have quite a close connection with nature. You don't really realize it until you don't have it. And I think that's, so for Hugh, very much that, the land management piece, for me, very much all about food. But actually the real driver, when Hugh came home to the family farm after university in 1991, I mean, he started planting trees and it seemed like a nice thing, and it was just the right thing to do. But the real driver was going organic, because he wanted to go organic and he wanted to sell his food directly to people. He felt very much that that farming and food had become quite disconnected from, farming had become disconnected from its actual end user. And it's when you start engaging with customers and you start talking to people directly, they kind of drive what you do. And also there was a huge economic impact. back in the late 90s, the impact of BSE on the beef price was massive, and there was cap reform, and it became there was support to go organic. There was good support to go organic, and so for Hugh, that was the right time to go in. But the real driver, the real kind of eureka moment, was he took lambs to market in 2000 and got less than £25 a lamb. And he had got £54 per lamb as a wee boy selling his pet lambs in 1974. And you don't need to be a rocket scientist to realize that actually it's time to change. And it's time to change in a big, radical way. And so if you've had those ambitions, now is the time. You have to get on with it and do it, because it was kind of make or break. Do we stay in farming or not? So we went organic, started selling our food directly to people at the same time, and really just got going. And our customers have always driven what we do. And so all the various different, but because we started engaging with customers and understanding that people wanted this thing that we were producing and that it was good, and we started talking about taste and flavor and breeds and feeding of animals, and customers started asking us really searching questions. So you start to think about your practice much more. And so, for example, in the last sort of few years since the Pasture for Life organization started, we've become Pasture for Life certified, and that's been driven by our customers. So that has allowed us, that has got us thinking about our grass in a much more detailed way. So a few years ago, maybe about 4 or 5 years ago, we started experimenting with herbal lays, rotational graze, and quite some time ago, looking at rotational grazing, and just all these kinds of things that your customers are asking you questions, and it makes you think, you know, what do you feed your cattle on? Oh, well, we feed them on grass and a bit of barley. And they go, oh, right. Oh, barley, right, grain, okay. And so we start thinking about that, and then we go, okay, well, we'll go pasture fed, which is 100% pasture fed. And so then we need to think about how we use our land differently and what we grow. So that's a rather long, rambling answer, but in many ways, a lot of what we've done in our butcheries and the services that we've offered to people and the products that we've started to grow have been driven by our customers within the resources of the farm that we have. And I think that's really important. People say, do you want to get bigger? You know, some person will come and say, we want to export 400 of your cattle every year to Hong Kong. And you go, well, okay, yeah, we don't have 400 cattle. Well, can't you get bigger? And you go, I don't really want to get bigger. I want to work within the confines of what our land can give us. And that's very much a key driver for us, I think, is working within the confines of what we have.
That is absolutely fascinating. And what's coming to my mind is that answering the consumer, when the consumer sort of says, well, what do you feed your cattle? And it's that whole integration piece, that integration of how we look after the land, how we look after the animals, the crops, and how that feeds all the way back up to the supply chain, right the way back to the consumer. And if I can bring you in there, Davy, in terms of, you talked a wee minute ago about that integrated management piece. And if you could briefly tell us a little bit more about that and how you've done that at Kirkton.
Yep. So, I mean, going back to what Sascha and Marion was saying there, I mean, up until about 25 years ago, we ran a high input, high output system across most of the farm. And high input, we were getting good productivity from our sheep production. But we think of, you can't get into the farm without crossing the River Fillen, which is part of the headwaters of the Tay. So we think of the farm as things that come over the bridge, and usually things that come over the bridge are expensive. It's bought in elements. And so that high input, high output system had been working fine for, I don't know, the 15 years previously it had been operating. But in the sort of the early to mid 90s, as I think it was Sascha, but apologies if it was Marion, as the bottom fell out of the sort of sheep market, it was no longer economically viable. So we took a management decision to move to a sort of a low input, low output system. And also at that time, Sascha had mentioned common agricultural policy reform and the McSharra reforms of 92, where agri-environment was coming much more to the fore. So we started to sort of investigate, well, what type of environmental benefits do we already have on the farm? And although I wasn't associated directly with the farm, then I wasn't even with SRUC at that point. At that point, myself and others were also trying to make this, make the point that across Europe, and we have a wide variety of farming systems that we now call high nature value farming systems, where the actual biodiversity that's there is dependent on the agricultural management practices. And just getting at that point, conservationists and farming were even more at daggers drawn than they potentially are now. And there wasn't an acceptance that farming could provide benefits to the environment. In fact, we were stressing that much of the habitats and many of the species that we put high nature conservation value on are there because of the farm management practices, not despite the farm management practices. So that was the sort of the general context and rationale as to what we were doing. And as I said, we were primarily put on this planet to look at the agricultural challenges in that environment, and that was still where the bulk of our research funding was coming from at that point in time. So we were just the same as anybody else. Elements of what we were started to introduce on the farm, we were doing it at a small scale, primarily in the early years. I don't know if you can see behind me, and that's a fenced off. That's one of the burns on the lower part of the farm that runs through the lower part of the farm. We basically got agri-environment scheme funding at that point in time to fence off the water margins and allow the vegetation that had been suppressed by the continual grazing just to sort of bounce back. And those water margins are extremely rich floristically. During the summer, they're a haven for insects. There are areas that the swallows and the house martins, the bats, the barn owls all feed along. They're an important part of the sort of the biodiversity resource on the lower part of the farm. And from our point of view, actually fencing off, I think it was originally 2 meters either side of the watercourse, wasn't a big loss to us from any sort of grazing perspective. In fact, actually, because we had to then run water pipes to troughs within the fields, it actually benefited the livestock not having to scramble about in muddy, pools in the burn. They could actually just go to a water trough that was fed by mains water. So that's how we started off. We made it happen just like any other farmer had to make it happen from an agri-environment perspective. We're still continuing that, still at a small scale in the lower part of the farm, where we've integrated much more in the way of small areas of trees, succession trees within the grazing field. So there's trees there, but they can't get succession going because any young seedlings are nibbled out with the livestock. So we've planted individual trees with protection in there as succession there, using Loch Lomond and the Trossachs National Park funding. And we also used agri-environment funding to put in small areas of wetlands, wader scrapes on the farm, which, although it will take more than what we're doing to actually get lapwing and curlew back at the scale in the strath that's needed. Those wader scrapes are the first standing water that we've had on the farm ever. With 2.5 to 3.5 meters of rain a year, our primary rationale historically was get it off the farm, into the Tay and gone. And so these, it's just shallow pools. They are now havens for insects like dragonflies. We know there's waterfowl using them, there's snipe using the vegetation around it, etc., etc. So they are doing what we said we wanted to do in the tin. But then it's 25 years ago, colleagues were very ambitious. We also took one of our, if you think of the farm like a capital Y, with the arms of the Y and the leg of the Y being the water courses, we've got 2 big highland glens. And 22 years ago, a decision was taken to plant montane woodland in one of those glens, primarily to try and provide shelter for livestock at that height. So we have gone through that process on a large scale over the last 22 years. And then in the more recent 3 to 4 years, we've also engaged in, we've restored about 60 hectares of peatland, again, high altitude peatland between 500 and 700 meters up one of the ridges of one of our mountains. So, and we've done that by applying for the planting, the peatland, we've done that for applying for larger scale grants, because that was then much more in our power to do so, because there was myself, there's a colleague, John Holland, on the farm who are both ecologists and we're wanting to push things in more in that sort of direction.
Thank you. A very comprehensive answer there, Davy, but a multitude of different things that have been implemented there on the two farms. I'd like to explore a little bit more now about, what have the overall results been, and are they what you expected? And Sascha, if I could start with you, the decisions you made, the why we've talked about, have the overall results been what you expected? Do you think they're going to change now as consumers feel closer and are more driven to support biodiversity, sustainability, products and services that support the land?
Yeah, I think that's a really an interesting question. The results, gosh, well, we would never go back. We're just, it's embedded in everything we do now, because each of our fields that aren't permanent grassland are in a 6-year rotation. So we have 3 years of grassland, maybe a 4th, followed by where we build soil fertility using clover, herbal lays, multi-species mixes, and then we have 3 or 2 years of cropping, and we now grow. We basically try and operate a little kind of circular feedback loop in our farming system. So all the grain that we grow is almost entirely wheat and pea or oat and pea mix. So there's an intercropping mixes to try and boost the protein content, as Hugh discussed, in our grain, and optimize the protein content for the resource input that we've had to use. We have a tractor which burns red diesel. I mean, that is just a fact of life. And I think in all of this, one must never shy away from the concept that we do still use finite resources, and we can't be perfect, but it's all about a transition, and it's all about looking at what you're doing and making small changes and taking steps along the way to decarbonizing in our farming system. So anyway, to go back, the results that we've seen, it's been really interesting. In the last few years, I've done a series of, had a little agritourism offer on the go. It was very much in response to customer demand. Can we come and visit your farm? And I used to just go, no. And then, because it was just like, oh God, you've got to tidy up the farm and make it all perfect and all that kind of thing. And then one year I just went, oh, right then, yes. And suddenly people want to come and visit the farm. Great. The things you talk about and the understanding that they gain from coming to visit a farm is absolutely incredible. We'd always been RET volunteers, the Royal Highland Educational Trust. And RET is an amazing organisation. It brings parties of school children onto farms and teaches them that milk comes from cows, flour comes from grain. And we've always hosted RET visits, and that really gave us the confidence to engage with the general public, with adults. Because, if you can handle a tough question from a 9-year-old, really you can handle anything that an adult is going to throw at you. You can manage customer expectations. And so we started doing that. And there's a real hunger out there for people who want to get closer to farms. They want to meet real people doing real jobs. They're genuinely interested in nature, biodiversity, in how the land works. How does farming work? What does it involve? Why do you use those cows? Why do you use those sheep? Look at those flowers over there. What are they? What does that mean? Why are they there? This kind of thing. You start to talk about soil health, and you start to talk about the multi-species lays and how the different plants root at different depths, and they immediately get it. They get it. And I think that's, for me, certainly, that is just amazing. I just think that's an incredible thing, that people want to come to visit a farm and are genuinely interested in what is going on in our soil. Now, admittedly, they're not droves and droves of people, but there are people out there who are looking for that kind of experience because they want it to inform how they eat as well. And you can argue that it's quite a middle class thing, all that kind of thing, but actually, if we don't start there with the people who can afford it, then we're never going to make any traction or gain any strides. So the results have been, it's been amazing. I've been continually thrilled with the feedback that our customers give us. They say things like, your turkey tasted incredible, your chicken tastes amazing, your lamb is so flavoursome. How is it like that? It tastes really sweet. And these are these are the flavors that you get when you farm in a slightly different way. You don't use those bought-in inputs. You try and farm using what the land grows and can give you. So yeah, the results, yeah, very happy with the results. Yeah, that's all I can say.
That is plenty. That's amazing. And actually, then, if Marion, what are the wins that you and you've experienced, you and Simon, and I'm interested there that Sascha used the word flavour, and that's the word you use a lot as well, Marion. So, what have been the key wins for you?
Yeah, the flavour is fundamental to everything, and I think I don't come from a farming background. And I think actually that's hugely useful. And actually I don't come from a distilling background. And again, having a different way of looking at things and not having people tell you this is how it should be done actually was probably at the heart of why we wanted to do things differently as well. Because we are, my husband and I are both geneticists by training. We studied genetics, so actually understanding the genetic basis of biodiversity is absolutely, you know, in our blood. That's kind of where we started, and I suppose we understand the resilience that brings to any biological system, and so we don't look at our farm from a farming point of view, because we're not farmers by training. We look at it from a biological systems point of view. And that's the way that it informs. And so when you study biology and understand how ecosystems work, you understand that actually you can't take anything out of the system without depleting it. You have to be regenerating it. And we like to talk about our farm as being not just sustainable, but actually regenerative. We are regenerating soil, we're regenerating biodiversity, we're regenerating the wildlife, the insect life, the mammals that depend on that. So we're building resilience through the biodiversity that we are promoting, and that resilience is the same resilience that all ecosystems have. The biodiversity works at different levels to support different species that all have different interactions. So you can't just have a monoculture and expect everything else to be able to survive on it, because, well, why would they? Because you've removed all of the habitat, or removed all of the flowers, the pollinators, all of the nectar that comes at different times of years. So you have to think about, and I guess that's fundamental to kind of how we think about the farm, is we think about how it impacts on everything, rather than just thinking about how it impacts on what we're farming and how we're taking, the meat and the botanicals out of the system. And I suppose the way that we look at that as well is the way that we harvest stuff. So all of our botanicals are harvested sustainably. We only take a small amount from each tree. We're only taking 10% at the most of foliage from any particular tree, often much, much less than that. And when we're harvesting fruits, or flowers, we never use ladders. So it's always just the bottom bit. So there's plenty left for everything else. So actually working with nature and supporting it means that you're promoting everything whilst still being able to harvest something that is a benefit that our business runs on.
That's so powerful, because that's something that came out of the recent Wild Foods webinar, and that we did that really thing about just taking what you need. And Davy, if there was one thing on with your work, that's one clear win that you feel, what would that one thing be?
Well, I've already mentioned the stuff we've done what we've done on the lower part of the farm, integrating the biodiversity there. We've done it without interfering with any of the sort of the land management at all. I suppose the one clear win, and it's one that we didn't actually even anticipate or know about at the time. So the upland woodland that we've created, the 250 odd hectares of what's called montane woodland, that hasn't worked, in terms of we were originally going to be putting the livestock back into the woodland. colleagues that developed that approach were very ambitious. They thought we could plant the woodland and we can put the livestock back in 10 years later and they would get the landscape benefits from that. That's not happened. 22 years down the line, it's still growing very, very slowly. The unexpected element was it's the understory vegetation, the ground vegetation, with actually taking the grazing by both sheep and we're protecting it from deer off. It's the heather, it's the bilberry, it's the millet, it's all that vegetation that's come back. And actually part of what we're looking at now is what is the benefit of that type of vegetation at that altitude in that part of the catchment in terms of managing water quantity, holding water back in that. That's something we would never have thought that we would get the additional benefit. There's a biodiversity benefit clear within that area. We've got some woodland birds community starting to establish, but it's actually the fact that we're now getting additional benefits for having that management on that part of the farm that no one ever thought about. In fact, had we thought about planting woodland from a water quantity management perspective, actually 22 years ago, the Woodland Grant Scheme insisted on us keeping the trees away from the watercourses. If you were doing it now, primarily to actually help hold back water, you would be planting them close to the watercourses to try and get that benefit of the root systems, etc., etc., etc. So that for me is a result. When I started at the centre 2013, they took me to that part of the farm and said, "Didn't work. We still can't put the livestock in here from an agricultural production perspective." And I said, "Well, so what? We're halfway through a rewilding process. Let's look and see what's the differences, what's the benefits, what's the challenges, what's the disbenefits of this at this scale." And because these type of nature restoration projects take a long time before they come to any outcome, and everybody wants their answers today. Well, anybody starting any sort of nature restoration project today, it will be years down the line before you can fully say, yes, that outcome has been achieved, or no, it's not, or whatever. So we're just taking advantage of the fact that a land management decision was taken 22 years ago for one reason. We're able to actually look at it from a wider and a different perspective as well. And that for me is the result.
Thank you. And so some unintended, unexpected, but really good results there. But well, my next question is to the panel is, are there any negatives? Are there any things that you kind of didn't really factor in? And one thing you mentioned there, Davy, was that it takes a long time. This is not a short-term thing. This is a long-term. So if I may ask Marion, are there any kind of things that you thought, oh, I wish we'd done that maybe differently, or would do that differently next time around? Is there any sort of things that haven't quite, gone as you would want? Or maybe there aren't.
Not that I can think of. We've learned a huge amount along the way. And actually just trial and error is an amazing thing to just, some of the stuff is just not in books. And it's still being researched, but nature knows how to do it. So you just need to give it a little bit of help and just see what happens. But you can, I'm not sure there's anything we probably would have done differently, but I agree that, Davy, that some things, especially when you're looking at mountainscapes like your farm is there, it can take a long time. But actually, on the other end of the scale, things can change very fast, and you can get real benefit quite quickly in some cases as well. So one of the things that we did was we put in a wildlife pond. Ostensibly, it was because when we built a house, they had to have a pond to actually, if it went up in flames, they had to have access for the fire brigade. And the designer said, well, we'll put this huge pond in that was like 2 feet deep. And I said, well, I don't think so. I think we'll put a really deep pond in so that it can support a whole load of wildlife, and then it doesn't need to be quite so big. But actually, the wildlife that we have got in the pond, we now have, and this came very, very fast, amazing what just, you know, water will attract. We now have 3 species of dragonflies and 2 species of damselflies that live in our pond that's been established since 2014. So very quickly you can hugely increase, you know, insect biodiversity, particularly with just what you're planting and the habitat that you're creating. Of course, with other landscapes and trees, it takes a bit longer, but some things you can do very quickly.
So there's some real quick wins, and I guess that's really great for people when they come to stay as well, to sort of experience that huge biodiversity and from the work you've done. Thank you very much, Marion. Sascha, are there any sort of things, any things that have maybe not gone according to plan, negatives, things that you know, things that you might well thought, oh, you know, things that you didn't expect?
Yeah, the only negative I can say, and this comes straight from Hugh, it's the old adage, when was the best time to plant a tree? When is the best time to plant a tree? It was 20 years ago. And his only regret is that he didn't plant more trees when he first came home to the farm, because, you know, he came home 1991, gosh, that's quite a long time ago. That's 30 years. And you can really begin to see stuff happening in 30 years. And it also gives you that sense of time, you know, and it allows, well, should our next generation take on the farm, you know, we can point to things that we did, well, that Hugh did as a fresh-faced, eager 23-year-old, and say, well, this never used to be here, and now it's here. And these are the things that you see here. There's a woodland, there's some well-established parkland trees. And the Parkland Tree Project was really done because in 1991, we got the opportunity to purchase the neighbouring farm. And it was an amazing home farm for a traditional estate that owned significant chunks of Perthshire in the late 1700s, and has been broken up over the years. And the previous owners had been a pair of brothers who traded sheep. And so when we bought the farm, it was quite sick generally. And so first thing he did was set to and start planting a bunch of trees, because he saw the history of these wonderful parkland trees that had been the kind of parkland, the home parkland, landscape parkland for the big hoose. And he's like, right, okay, some of these trees are really knocking on, we better plant some more. And it was just, I think it was a kind of desire to kind of go, well, okay, we're the new owners, it's time to kind of to put our stamp on it, so that they'll be there in, you know, 200 years time. There'll be the weeping beeches or the you know, the fantastic oaks. They'll be well on their way. And I suppose, but any other negatives? The only negative, I suppose. Okay, fine, that's fine.
I don't want you to pull negatives out of the air. Interesting what you say. I heard recently somebody said that 30 years ago was the best time to plant a tree. Now is the second best time to plant a tree. So everyone bear that in mind. I want to lead on from this because we've got a bunch of people here that are interested in enterprise on farm, linked to biodiversity, linked to alternative products, whether they be food or whatever. And I want to just sort of, in order to help these guys, I want it, like each of you, if this is quite a big ask, to think about 2 pitfalls that people need to be aware of. You know, it could be something as simple as, you know, the ideas are easy, it's the implementation that's difficult. So a couple of pitfalls from each of you that people with thinking about innovation, thinking about a new business, thinking about enterprise, what they would need to think about. And Davy, I'm going to start with you if that's okay.
Yep. So the 2 that spring to mind for me is, I've already highlighted that we were very ambitious with our montane woodland planting, and for those that you can see behind me, that's a 22-year-old montane woodland. So the trees are there, they're just not very high, and so it's the bigger the scale you choose to do something, the bigger the risk that runs with it on your enterprise. Now, if it works fine and achieves what you want it to achieve, that's great. But if it doesn't, then you may be left, trying to work out how to sort of revise something. So that woodland that we planted, when it's about 10% of the size of the farm, but it was in one of the more productive parts of the farm, the upper parts of the farm. So that was a big risk that we took, even after going to a low input, low output enterprise sort of thing. We've turned it on its head. We're getting benefits out of it, from our perspective, but nevertheless, while we've got a lot of lessons learned out of what we've done there, I would certainly caution anybody in our sort of, or in that sort of landscape situation, going in at that sort of scale, completely fresh, and making sure they manage their own expectations as much as anybody else's expectations, in terms of how successful the establishment and the growth may actually be. We did that under a woodland grant scheme. We had the same conditions as doing that at 350 to 500 metres over nearly 1,500 feet, as we would have done had we been doing it down in sort of lowland Ayrshire sort of thing. Very difficult to actually achieve all those conditions. So scale, just be cautious about the scale that you actually go into, and at least accept the risks that's actually going there. The other one for me is, and hopefully this will change with time, I said a lot of what we've done on the lower part of the farm, we've done it under agri-environment schemes, and those agri-environment scheme funding have been welcome. But agri-environment here in Scotland is still very prescriptive. You decide to do something, and there's a certain list of conditions that you actually have to make. Now, we've made everything that we've done on the farm work for us, but we would still say, or I do say, that some of the management that we are have to do in some of these areas is not necessarily what's the best for the biodiversity outcome. The wader scrapes, the wetland area, is the most prime example. That has to be grazed in the late part of the summer, early part of the autumn, at a very low level. And that level is the timing, and the grazing density is dictated by the conditions of the agri-environment scheme that we're still part of. While I will be disappointed, because it ends this year, that we won't have the funding coming in for that area, we will still maintain that area as an agri-environment part of the farm, but it then gives us more of a flexibility to actually change the grazing density in there, that we think, because we're ecologists, will actually be much more beneficial to the wider biodiversity in that. Basically, the wader scrapes are fine, but the vegetation around it, even with low-level grazing, is still quite dense, and we think it's too dense. And for a similar reason, we took advantage of a small grant scheme with Loch Lomond and the Trossachs National Park to put more trees in on the lower part of the farm, including 100 trees within half of one of our fields as part of like a preliminary agroforestry approach. We did that rather than going through a woodland grant scheme because there was less conditions associated with the small grant. We could put what trees we wanted in where we wanted at the density we wanted. Whereas if we'd gone down a woodland grant, A would have to be bigger, but also there would have been a lot more conditions attached to that we don't necessarily agree is right for our environment. So those are the two negatives. Scale and some of the funding streams come with conditions that are not necessarily conducive to producing the range of biodiversity outcomes that are more possible if you're more familiar with your own site and what you can potentially get out of it.
Thank you. So 2 pitfalls there to be aware of if you're developing your own enterprise. Marion, do you have any pitfalls you would care to highlight?
I'm not sure we'd want to put what pitfalls. I guess the things that I was just sort of scribbling down here were, if you're going to do something, if you're going to go with a new product, you really have to research your market, and actually researching who you're going to sell your products to, whatever that innovation is fundamental to understanding your business plan. And so actually really understanding your customers and doing customer trials. We did a lot of customer trials across Scotland when we launched our first product to understand what people thought about it. And because it was so different from other spirits that were out there, some of that feedback was absolutely invaluable, even down to what we called it. we had one thing in our head and people went, oh God, no, don't call it that, don't call it that, nobody will buy it. So, you know, you have all these ideas, but actually you need to test them on your market and do some real market research. But I suppose the other thing is you need to do something, whatever you're innovating around, you need to be passionate about it. And there's no point in just doing something different for the sake of it. Really, it has to drive you, because people will hear the passion in your voice when you talk about what you do. I can hear it in Sascha, I can hear it in Davy as well, that actually we're completely passionate and obsessed with what we do. And that's the only way that you're going to be able to sell something, your products, to people, is if they believe you and they believe what you're doing. And we've seen that, we see that every time we're face to face with customers. But one of the other things is we're talking about biodiversity here and the benefits that that can have, but actually the diversity of your business is really, really important as well. We have on our very, very small farm, our farm is so small, we don't get any government subsidies for anything. So everything's been self-funded. But we have a holiday let, so we have a tourism offer, we have a distillery, we have meat, we also have agritourism, so we have visitors coming to the farm as well. And actually through the pandemic, that was just unbelievably important, because had we had literally all of our eggs in one basket, our business would have failed. You know, our holiday let wasn't allowed to be open for a long period of time, and actually longer than other people, because it's a big house, it sleeps 10. So when other people were open, we still weren't allowed to be open. But having the food offer, we were doing farmers markets and those were still running. So we still had some income coming in through that. So actually thinking about how the diversity of your business creates resilience in income streams is also really important as well. So not just biodiversity, but business diversity.
That's such an important point. Sascha, do you have anything you want to add to that?
I would completely echo what Marion says there about business diversity. I think it's absolutely critical, particularly farming at the moment. And, you know, Davy's alluded to having one system, which when things go wrong, that your system becomes unsustainable. And Marion's alluded to something like the pandemic. You know, we wouldn't have expected that. That's a 1 in 100-year event, or 1 in, you know, whatever. And businesses that have had diversity embedded in them have survived through it. I just made a couple of notes. One is around, sometimes it's really good to get some advice, and planning nature projects on land that doesn't have any existing kind of woodlands, etc. We've always worked with an experienced advisor, somebody who grew up on a family farm, had that passion for wildlife, nature, and kind of got the program. He got Hugh and got what Hugh wanted to achieve, but also was tied into had the knowledge of the various grant schemes, and so, you know, we were able to use that funding very effectively over the years. And so that's one thing. Don't assume that your habitat that you're creating for biodiversity is not habitat for production. Cattle and sheep, livestock, habitat for biodiversity can be habitat for livestock. Sheep shelter in hedges. Cattle eat the leaf litter that's fallen from the parkland trees, and that contains amazing nutrients that they probably wouldn't be able to get anywhere else. So there's a sort of, it's not either or in every project that you do. I think the panelists have both spoken and said anything else I might want to add.
That's fantastic, and you've all given us some sort of advice in that last piece there. So if I may, I'd like to open it up to questions from the floor. So Paul, I don't know whether we've got any questions in the chat, but certainly if anyone has any, oh, is that a hand going? No, that's my hand. Does anybody got any questions, Paul, that have come through?
Yeah, there's a few coming. I suppose start with Sascha here, and whether the others want to dip in. Jock Gibson asks, is being organic an important driver for promoting biodiversity? Think in particular of grass-based systems. And also on that, Rochelle has asked a question of you, Sascha. Did you notice a difference in your cattle livestock health when you moved from grass and grain to pasture feed, or pasture-fed cattle or animals?
Yeah, two quite specific questions. Thanks very much. So the first one was, do I feel that organic is essential? No, I don't think it is. For us, it provided us with the ability to find alternative markets for our livestock, initially, and then subsequent to that, we got the opportunities the market came to us for looking for organic poultry, both eggs and meat, and that drove. So it's enabled us to diversify our business, and it's enabled us to find a niche. It's also given us the framework to hang the various different agri-environment scheme projects that we've done here on the farm. But most importantly, the organic thing has helped us with our thinking. It's that circular thinking. If you're thinking that you're going to farm in an extensive manner, then you need to think, okay, well, how am I going to optimize the productivity of my beef herd? So you start to think about, and this is very much Hugh's thing, I'm really just using his words. You start to think about the breeding of your cattle. What do you want to achieve? You want to improve the calving rate. You want to improve the rates at which your cattle get back into, your cows come back into calf. How do you do that? You choose some estimated breeding values where you look for easy calving in your herd. So, and that's just one tiny example of how the thinking is very joined up in organic farming. So it's worked for us. I'm not saying it's a route that everyone should go down. I certainly think that, as Davy, I think it was either Davy or Marion alluded to, the various different farming systems that now make up the concept of high nature value farming. And I think that's excellent because it broadens the whole thing out to people, and it also allows people to think that, you know, not to be put off in optimizing their land for nature or their business for nature by going, oh crikey, I've got a whole bunch of paperwork to do, or I've got labels to think about, or whatever. So it's a sort of two-edged sword. It has allowed us to find a route to market, very important for business resilience, and to actually have a business, you know, 21 years after the real kind of bottom of the market. But it's not essential, and particularly in today's world where there's a lot more recognition and understanding about methodology rather than just kind of, oh, a word, it's organic, therefore it's good. So the second question, could somebody repeat that? Did we notice?
Yeah, it was, have you noticed a difference when you change from grass plus grain fed to pasture fed livestock?
Oh gosh, that's quite a tricky one. Let me think about this. I can't, in all honesty, answer that one with complete clarity. I think what I would say is that the flavour, and obviously we're biased, but we certainly had a lot more feedback on our lamb, in particular, the flavour of our lamb, since we went entirely pasture fed. And that has had to do with the planting of kale crops in the summer for winter in January, February. They go in there in January, February because there's not enough grass for them. And they used to come into the butchery with not enough fat cover. Now they come into the butchery and it's like, they're just fantastic. So going entirely pasture fed has produced that benefit in flavour through a traditionally tricky time of year to finish lambs, because we have to finish lambs all through the year. We have a dispatch every week, which is quite a challenge on finishing livestock, finishing livestock optimally every week. And our customers love it. It's a really great message. It's allowed us to now make the improvements of rotational grazing using herbal lays, and that's just great. The benefit, we have seen a significant health benefit, and it's just an anecdotal thing. We always have a few pet lambs every year, bless them. And every year, the problem with pet lambs is when you move them off milk and onto grass, They often, because they don't do it in a natural process, because you have to withdraw feeding them, literally, they go into the we always put them into the herbal leys, and they always thrive. And there's something in there in the herbal leys. There are anti-helminthic plants, and there are plants that are good for an animal's gut health, for rumen gut health. And they always thrive, and they do really well, and they end up going back into the flock or finishing lambs, and we don't lose them. There's something there. I don't know. I suspect, I would say to Davy, someone somewhere needs to do some research on that, and I'm sure somebody probably already is. I just don't know about it. But I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Thank you. Another one. Well, again, this is Jock, but it might also, you could incorporate, if you've got anything to add to Sascha's answer here. I'll ask you to start with, Davy, and then perhaps come to you, Marion. Is it important to measure biodiversity, and how do you practically do it? Which is a broad question.
Well, it's a broad question, and it's a pertinent question, but we also have to bear in mind that biodiversity is broad. Biodiversity stands for all living things. So yeah. My answer to that question, when I try and instill into the students, what I actually say to Scottish Government officials, because they've come to me in the past, what is farming's impact on biodiversity? Well, hang on a second, what are you talking about? What type of biodiversity? And so the answer to your question, Jock, will depend on what it is you're actually interested in. You know, what biodiversity, and be clear on that. So, you know, birds and bats are relatively easy to survey. Birds, you can see them or you can hear them, or individuals who are experienced with it can see them and hear them. Bats, although they are mainly around at night, they give out ultrasound signals, so you can actually hear using an acoustic device and identify what the bat species is. In fact, we are now trialling on farm, or will be trialling on the farm, for both birds and bats, remote sensors that we're just going to put out in the landscape. The bird one, I believe, although I haven't been involved in deploying it, I just pressed a button that said to buy it. I believe that bird sensor listens to all the bird noise within a sort of a 500-meter radius, and sends that to some university in the United States where there's a server there that says it's going to be bird X, Y, and Z, sends it back to the cloud, and we then pull it down from the cloud, sort of thing. So there's some things that can be done relatively easily or automatically. Vegetation, different types of vegetation needs more sort of specialist expertise, and needs people out there on their hands and knees crawling around who are able to do it. And some invertebrates like bees, hoverflies, again, specialist expertise can see them in the field and can assess them in the field. Other insect communities, it might take quite a long time, a laborious set of collection over the course of a summer to get some idea as to what's where. So. But it basically depends on what type of biodiversity you're talking about, how easy or more challenging it is to actually collect information on it. And so I think, you know, in terms of advice, and Sascha's already mentioned it to some extent, I would be saying, if anybody, particularly anybody who's not like myself or Marion, we're not ecologists, you know, which, you know, 90% of people are, land managers are, it's always worthwhile getting somebody in to give you some advice, to do an audit on your farm, to actually give you an idea of what might already be on the farm. Because I would say 9.5 times out of 10, they'll come back with something that the land manager, no fault of their own, didn't know was there, because it's just not something they're attuned into actually seeing. So they can tell you what's there on the farm. Just as importantly, they can tell you what the potential is for doing more for biodiversity on one part of the farm. And while that audit will then help your thinking, I would strongly suggest that people should think then carefully what they want to do. And Sascha and Marion have already said, what elements of then biodiversity management, either maintaining or producing new, do I want to do on my land? Why do I want to do it? And how can it be actually integrated more into the farming system? Either I can do it and it's not going to interfere with the farming system because ethically that's what I want to do, or I can do it because it sits alongside a farming system and I can use it as an additional marketing tool, or I can do it because it produces biodiversity benefit and actually gives me other benefits. I forgot to say earlier, Kerry, the other unexpected benefit of all the trees we've been planting in the lower part of the farm, primarily from a biodiversity perspective, and what we thought would be shelter for livestock during the winter. The last 3 summers, we've seen almost drought-like conditions on the farm. We've seen our livestock in those fields seeking out, trying to get close to trees at the riverside, etc. So I would be saying, while putting trees into fields might still seem strange at the minute to many farmers and land managers, actually that's going to be what you need in the future for summer shelter as much as winter shelter. And apologies, Marian or Sascha's already said it, the best time to have planted those trees was 20 or 30 years ago. You know, the next best time is now, because you will need them not in 20 or 30 years. You're going to need them ideally, that shelter next year, the year after, and the year after. Trees will take time to grow. Sorry, that was a bit long-winded answer. Hopefully, Jock, that helps in terms of your question about how to measure it, how to assess it. You're muted, Paul. Sorry.
So perhaps, Marian, you could just perhaps answer that. But being an ecologist or biologist, as Davy said, or you said, you know, do you actually audit and have a look at what you've got on the farm on a sort of basis?
Yes, we do. And we did baseline surveys when we first arrived to actually look at what we had before we started introducing native species. But I suppose the thing to really think about is what kind of ground you have, what kind of terrain you have, your altitude. All of that is going to determine what you can grow, but what would be there naturally, and really kind of be aware of that. There, you know, you can get people to come in and do plant surveys. It might not, you might not need to do that though, depending on exactly as Davy said, depending on what kind of biodiversity you want to promote. If you're talking about hedges, actually the best kind of trees for hedges are a greatest number of different species that you can get your hands on, but all native. So the benefit of having native trees over anything else is that they will support other species. If you use non-natives, then they're not going to support the same amount of species. So for example, oak trees, they have the biggest biodiversity gain that you could possibly get. So there's more than 1,000 other species of birds, insects, fungi, lichens that are supported by oak. It's one of the keystone species of biodiversity. So if you want the most, plant oaks, but actually having a huge range, as many different types of trees in your hedgerows as possible. And actually the other thing that is of real benefit to wildlife is what the technical term is rugosity, but actually it's the shape of your so actually margins and, you know, the edges of things are really beneficial, and having a different landscape, your diversity of shape of landscape and habitat is also really important. So, you know, it depends on what your ground looks like and what it can support. But yeah, absolutely try and pack in as much as you possibly can, because that's the thing that creates the resilience in your system. And things that are going to flower at different times of year, produce pollen, nectar, and fruit for feeding wildlife at different times of year is all essential to have in there.
Thank you. There is one other question which we may have read, but it's quite a long one, and I'm very conscious of the time. And it's from Nonnie, who's had to leave. She texted me to say she's left. So I said what I might do is I'll send it to the 3 panelists, and if you wouldn't mind thinking about it and just sending her an email back, that would. But it's about, you know, should we be putting a value on biodiversity, an economic value, and the fact that, you know, like carbon is starting to talk about a carbon market for rural carbon. You know, should we start should we be thinking, and is it a good thing to be thinking about a biodiversity market of some description? I mean, that's the crux of her question, but I don't know whether you can each have a sentence before we go on that.
Yes,
Sascha's
indeed.
got-
I see Sascha's got her hand up first, so.
Yeah, this is something that is kind of close to our hearts, not necessarily the monetary value, but the concept that sometimes, say for example, in our herbal lays, through the summer months, it's not only about the fact that herbal lays, the different rooting depths will pull nutrients up from the soil, that our pet lambs thrive on it, and there's a diverse range of plants in it with lots of different flowers. It's the fact that there are yields that come from that aren't monetized, but we know are good for they're good for biodiversity. But they're also good for our farm, and that's not currently monetized. So, for example, the vast number of pollinators that field of flowering herbal lays supports, there's no monetary value on that, but it's an incredible place to just go and walk through, and you watch the bees and the insects all buzzing around. The flowers are beautiful. There's a value in there that is very, very hard to monetize. So that's the challenge with all these markets. You know, how do you creating a market for that? How do you monetize pleasure, enjoyment, connection with nature? How do you monetize the pollinator species that are there? That's the challenge. Really tough. Jock Gibson talked about asked the question about measuring biodiversity. That's the kind of challenge you're thinking of.
Mm-hmm. It's okay if I come in, Paul and
Yeah.
Kerry. Yeah, I agree with what Sascha said. You know, actually putting a direct financial value on biodiversity is very difficult at this point in time, will remain very difficult at this point in time. But if we step back a bit, having biodiversity and value from biodiversity on your farms is going to become increasingly important. So the way Scottish Government policy development is going is we're not going to get rid of direct payments immediately, but at least 50% of those direct payments are going to come with what they call environmental conditionality on them. Now, they're still working through what those conditions would actually be, but biodiversity, doing more for biodiversity on your farm will be one of those conditions. Now, it's not going, as I said earlier in response to Jock's question, Scottish Government are not going to say everybody has to do something for hedgerows on their farm, because not everybody has hedgerows, nor should everybody have hedgerows. There's going to be a bit more flexibility, but there will be a value to the business of having more biodiversity management on your farm, or biodiversity rich areas on your farm, because that will count towards your environmental conditionality. Going forward, it will allow you to access the land management support that's going to be there in the future post 2024. Although there's going to be some things trialed prior to that. That is the way of the world. So it's not just a nice thing to have. There's going to be a value to the business. By actually having it, it means you will have to do less on your farm because it's already there. We had a reassurance last week from the Cabinet Secretary, Marian Bruce, at the NFUS's autumn conference, that conditionality, and this is a very important point, it's been something that I've been arguing about and others have been arguing about for the last 30 years. Many bureaucrats like to pay for something that is a change. You do something different, you're here where you are, and then you're doing something different, and they'll only pay for that change. We've got acceptance, at least last week, from Marian Bruce and some of our civil servant colleagues, that is not a just and equitable approach to paying and rewarding, recognising biodiversity and other environmental management, i.e. those people that are already doing it, they're already producing the outcome that's being valued, they should be recognised for that, and that should count towards their conditionality, and not just actually focus the future funding on encouraging other people to actually change. There's a need for both, there's a room for both. So biodiversity, although you can't monetize it, will be a value to the business going forward. to any business going
Thank you.
forward.
Anything to add, Marion?
Yeah, we've done a lot of research in this area and part of lots of conversations around what's called natural capital. It's a term that I don't particularly like, for exactly the same reason that I think Sascha probably doesn't like it, but it is what people are calling it. It implies that nature can be capitalized, which as we move towards the end of capitalism is probably not something, but however, it's a term that people are using, whether we like it or not. And I completely agree with Davy that actually the within natural capital circles and the way that this is being funded through carbon voluntary carbon payments is that there's an additionality that isn't required for those kind of schemes. I completely agree that actually those people who have the refugia of biodiversity on their land that haven't degraded their land or have done the right thing absolutely should be rewarded in the schemes that are being designed at the moment, and we're part of that conversation about how that happens and to ensure that happens, and it's not just those people that have the ability to create additional biodiversity or ecosystem services gains that are being rewarded in the schemes going forward. It's absolutely fundamental, I think, to the way that we think about our landscapes. But existentially, it's a 3-hour conversation about. It's not something you can answer in 2 minutes. As about, should we put a value on nature? Yeah. Effectively, no. But that's we need to perhaps in the short term embrace the way that it's being funded to restore our ecosystems in the short term.
Thank you. I think I'm conscious of the time, Kerry, so I think we'd probably better wrap it up there.
Okay, well, listen, some great questions, actually, some fantastic answers. I just want to say thanks, guys. I thank you for your time, but your energy, your enthusiasm, your knowledge, your intuition, it's been fantastic tonight. You've really given us a great evening and a great event, and I want to thank you. And I'm sure everyone that's been involved tonight, I know some of them have had to go because we're getting towards 8:30, but I'm sure they will have benefited from this. And thank you once again for your time and your input, and we look forward to seeing you at future events. Thank you, guys.